Philip Hammond was forced to defend his decision to offer tax cuts for high earners whilst continuing to freeze benefits, arguing it was the right and moral thing to do because he was sticking to his election promise. BBC presenter Nick Robinson grilled the Chancellor on his decision to increase the personal income allowance and offer tax reliefs for higher earners, whilst there are still millions of pounds worth of 2015 welfare cuts going into this system. Speaking on the Today programme, he said to Mr. Hammond that his policy of raising the income tax allowances disproportionately helps the rich and not the poor. And he pointed out that people were frustrated with the announcement that schools would be getting £10,000 to £50,000 in a one-off payment to help with little things when some are faced with serious staffing shortages. £2.7 billion cut to income tax, but Mr. Hammond said that he had chosen to stand by his party's manifesto promises, and said that, overall, those on lower incomes were still better off under his budget. On the one hand, you didn't have the money to promise more money for schools, but you did find £2.7 billion to cut income tax, Mr. Robinson said. It is right and moral and conservative philosophy to cut income tax whilst freezing benefits for millions of people, which means couples with children will lose £200, Mr. Hammond replied. Nick, it is not a choice. When you make a promise to the electorate and they elect you, then you have an obligation to deliver on that promise. Right and moral. It is right and moral and conservative policy to deliver on the commitments that we make in our election manifesto. When Mr. Robinson asked him to confirm that welfare cuts would still be in place, he responded, I put $6.5 billion into universal credit and raised the national living wage in a way that will support many people on low earnings that will also be receiving benefits. Philip Hammond's budget announced more funding for universal credit, but welfare cuts are still in place. Reuters, if you look at all measures of the budget, it is those on the lowest incomes that proportionately benefit the most from it. His comments defending his policies came after the Resolution Foundation, a research organization focused on people on low and modest incomes, said poorer families would be about £30 a year better off from the tax cuts, with the top 10% earners £410 better off. NHS splurge. Mr. Hammond also refused to deny that there would have to be cuts in government departments in order to allow enough headroom for extra NHS spending. The Chancellor said the amount of money that would be spent on public services would be decided in the spending review next year. Read the budget announcements at a glance, but conceded that the commitment we have made to health, i.e. the £20 billion boost for the NHS, meant that the government would be left with a flat real spending available for all other departments. This would mean that other departments would be left with a 0% spend increase on average, with inflation taken into account. Cuts in other departments. Mr. Robinson pointed out that this meant that, if the Chancellor wanted to increase spending anywhere, he would have to cut spending elsewhere in order to maintain an average of zero. Chancellor of the Exchequer Philip Hammond, so some departments will face a cut, he said. You have made all sorts of promises to other people like international aid, so if you give them money you have to make cuts elsewhere. He replied, that's a choice that we make, isn't it? You do have a choice of everybody having 0.0% real, in other words maintaining their spending power in real terms after inflation year after year after year. Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell dismissed the Chancellor's claim austerity is coming to an end as he insisted it is rolling out still. He said, I think people will be crushingly disappointed at yesterday because it certainly wasn't the end of austerity. Mr. McDonnell said Labour would support tax cuts, but make the system fairer if the party won power. More budget news.